This tutorial is about a method for animating still photographs for documentary films called parallax animation. As documentary filmmakers, we don't always have access to B-roll or even motion pictures to illustrate our stories, and sometimes we have to rely on still photographs. But of course, we prefer to have them move if at all possible. So here I have a photograph of the great naturalist John Muir. And so I'm going to just put him on our timeline. And of course we can reframe by going up to Effect Controls, going to Scale, blowing up the image a little bit, and then moving the vertical position downwards so that he is framed better. To make him move, the simplest thing is to use the so-called Ken Burns effect, by which you make keyframes at the beginning and then move the playhead forward, increase the scale, and then probably reframe, usually on someone's face or some prominent object, and there we have a simple move. And that's really a lovely classic effect, one that I use a lot in my work. But there is another more complex type of animation that's become very popular lately, and it is called parallax animation. I'll show you a basic example of this that I was able to create in a little less than an hour. As you can see, it creates the illusion of a 3D environment through which I am kind of moving the camera rather than just zooming in. It creates the illusion that I'm arcing and dollying in. And this can be done without too much trouble by using a combination of Adobe Premiere and Photoshop. Here are some excerpts from documentaries I found online that use the parallax effect in somewhat more complicated ways, moving different layers around to create a really immersive 3D kind of effect using just still 2D photographs. One thing that's important when you're doing this kind of work is to choose a photo that can be easily separated into layers. This photograph is a good candidate because there are three pretty distinct layers. Here in the foreground we have the hat and the rock. In the middle ground is John Muir, and in the background trees and grass and water. And these are all kind of abstract patterns that are pretty easy to manipulate and duplicate using the rubber stamp tool in Photoshop. And Photoshop is where we're going to go to separate this photograph into layers. So I'm going to my original photo here, this JPEG file on my hard drive, right-clicking and going to open with Adobe Photoshop. Photoshop opens, there it is. I'm going to make the window a little bigger and blow up the image to, let's say, 120%. And now I want to separate this into several layers. So I'm going to the background image, which is locked, and so immediately I know I need to create a duplicate of that. So here is background copy. That layer will be for the background. I want a separate layer for John and for the rock. So I'm going to again right-click and go to duplicate layer. I'm going to call this layer John. And then yet another layer, right-clicking, duplicate layer, and I'm going to call this layer rock. Okay. Now the main layer I want to work on is John Muir. I want to separate him from the background. So I'm going to hide all of the other layers by clicking on the eyeballs here and selecting the layer called John. Photoshop provides a quick tool for removing a background or selecting a subject. I'm going to try this and see what it does. So if I click remove background, it did a pretty good job of removing the background, except for it also selected the hat and the rock. I didn't get this part, so that is not quite perfect. So I'm going to undo that, and we're going to do a little more work to manually select John. So we need a tool called the Object Selection tool, which is not always a default tool here in your toolbox. To find this tool, go to these three little dots and click on it. Go to Edit Toolbar, and this window pops up, and then search in the toolbar for the Object Selection tool, and then drag it over to the Extra Tools window and click Done, and now that tool appears here. So we select it. You make sure that you've got the Object Finder checked, and now as you move around, you'll see it selects things it thinks you might want as a subject, like the sky or John or his hat. We want John. So we're going to left click on John, and it has selected him fairly well. Here you can see this dotted line is the actual selection. So then we go up to where it says Select and Mask. We click on that, and there we go. And it's done a pretty good job. There are a couple areas that are going to need work. His fingers have been cut off, and also this area has not been selected. This area has not been selected, so we're going to want to remove those. So to do that, we have these brush tools up here that will help us. To add the fingers back in, we go to the third one down, called the brush tool. First, I'm going to zoom in on the hand so we can work a little more accurately. We can see those fingers hiding back there. So let's go to the brush tool. We can adjust the size of the brush up here. I think this 7 or 8 is a pretty good size. So now I can paint the hand back in. I think we're missing some dark area here of the fingers. Okay. Also his wrist, the dark area was not selected. So let's paint that back in. And you have to be very creative with your mouse here. If you want a straight line, just click once and then hold down the Shift key and click in another area like here, and it will draw a straight line. So that has helped. Now, these two areas are problematic. They need to be removed under the knee and under the arm. So we have this brush here, which should remove this stuff for us. I'm going to click once there, hold down the Shift key, and it's hard to see what it's doing, but yeah, you see the little grid pattern that's appearing. It is removing this stuff, but we're probably going to have to clean it up with the eraser tool a little bit later on. Let's clean up this area somewhat. Yeah, you really can't see very well what it's doing, but it is removing a lot of this stuff. Okay, good. Let's go back to 120%, and then we are ready to click OK. And there we go. We can see the mask is pretty good. We didn't get it perfect on the hand, but I think it's probably good enough. So now we want to remove the background. But right now it's John who's selected, and we want to select the background to remove. So I go up to Select and Inverse, and now you see everything except for John has been selected. So I can hit the Delete key on my keyboard and the background goes away. But we still have problems here in these areas. So we're going to work on that manually. First, I want to get rid of this selection. To do that, I'm just going to go to the rectangular marquee selection tool and click anywhere in here, and the selection is gone. But I want to erase this extra junk that's in here. So let's zoom in on that. Zoom in. Okay, and let's go to the eraser tool right here. Reduce the brush size a little bit. And now we can just draw around here. I'm going to hold down Shift key to draw straight lines till all this gray stuff goes away and we get this grid pattern pretty solidly in there. Just erase, 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 erase. There we go. Back to 120%. Alrighty. So we've got John separated pretty well. And now we want to work on the rock. Okay, I'm going to turn off John. I'm going to turn on the rock so we get the whole photo. And now our job is to isolate the rock and the hat from the rest of the photo. Now, if I try to use the object selection tool, it will recognize the hat, but the artificial intelligence is just not intelligent enough to read my mind to know that I want the rock. So we are going to have to select that ourselves. But first, we can start with the hat. Sure, we will want to remove the hat. So I'm going to left click on that. It's going to isolate the hat. But now I want to add to the selection. So what I'm going to do is go up here to where you have a choice between a rectangle or a lasso selection tool. Let's use the lasso selection tool. And now, in order to add to this selection, I have to hold down my shift key. And then I start drawing. And you don't have to be accurate. Just roughly select the area that you want selected. And then when I release it, look at that. It snapped right to the edge of the rock. So yeah, it's pretty smart. The only thing it didn't get was this shadow. So we're going to have to select that. So first I'm going to go to select and mask. And there we see, yep, everything's been selected in this area except for that darn shadow. So we're going to add that back in. So we go to the third brush down, the brush tool. Now we can use a bigger brush. Let's go up to, I don't know, 20. And then just brush over this area. Yep. And that shadow comes right back in. Okay. And now we're ready to click OK. And there, beautiful. It has selected this whole area. But of course, we want to reverse the selection. So we go up to Select and Inverse. There, now everything outside of the rock has been selected. So we can hit the Delete key and it all goes away. Beautiful. And then to get rid of the selection, I go to the rectangular marquee tool, click anywhere, and now we have just the rock. We're really moving along. So we've got the rock and we've got John. Now we have to work on the background. So I'm going to turn off these layers, turning off the rock and John. We're going to turn on the background copy, and there it is. Now here's where we have to get really creative, because we have to remove the rock and John from this photograph. But of course we can't just leave empty space. We have to fill in anything we remove with grass and trees and water and so on. And we're going to do that with Photoshop's wonderful rubber stamp tool. Select that, and we want a pretty big brush. To use this, we first select an area that we want to duplicate. So I want to put grass all across here. So I just go over here and hold down the Option key, and that selects a target area. I'm clicking there, and then when I come over here, we can start painting grass over John. How far can we go? Only that far. Now we're going to have to retarget, but I can keep on making grass here. And you see it's going to fool the eye pretty well. So I just work my way around the picture, grabbing stuff and duplicating it to cover up the foreground. And it's pretty easy to do this when it's grass and trees and sky and stuff like that. It would be much harder if it was people or a cityscape or something like that. But this is pretty easy to do, and it's fun. John is gone. Wow, okay. And, it's a little crude, but keep in mind that this area, most of this area, is going to be covered up again by John and the rock, but we just need to have a background that these other layers can move against. So we're putting John back in, and we're putting the rock back in. We got to turn all these layers on before we save this. And so now we are ready to save this as a Photoshop document. Make sure you don't save it as a TIFF or anything else. Save it as a Photoshop document, and then we will be importing this multi-layer Photoshop document into Premiere to begin the actual parallax animation. Here I am in Adobe Premiere. I've got a empty project. I've created a sequence at HD 1080 by 1920, and now I need to import my Photoshop document. So I'm going to import my Photoshop document with multiple layers. And now this is very important. The default will be merge all layers. I do not want that. Instead, I want to bring it in individual layers so that I can manipulate them individually. So I click OK, and I get a folder, which I can then open up, and here are my layers. So first, the background, there it is, and I'm going to target video 1 and put it on the timeline. And now John Muir will be second. Put him on video 2. There's John, and now the rock on the top layer. Targeting video 3, and there's my rock. All 3 layers. Now, the background does not quite fill the frame. I've got pillar boxing, so I need to increase the scale of the background, taking it from 100 up to about 120. Next, I'm going to move my playhead forward because I want to animate all 3 layers, including the background. So moving a little ways into the sequence and then making keyframes for both position and scale. And then here near the end, I'm going to increase the scale of the background a little bit, not too much, because the background moves less than the foreground when we do parallax. And then I'm going to want to slide it. I think I want to slide it to the left as far as I can go. So let's look at that movement. Yeah, a little bit of movement there. And now I want to move John and the rock. So I'm going to go to my first keyframe that I created by using the keyframe navigation button. And now I think I'm going to work on the rock first. So I'm going to maybe make it a little bit bigger to start with. Let's slide it up and a little to the left. I don't want that edge there. Okay, and let's animate this a little more than a lot more actually than the background. So we start with position and scale keyframes and jump to the last keyframe, and let's see how much bigger. I'm going to start at 110 and let's go up to 125 or so. Now it's slid down. I don't want that. I want to have it stay up in the frame somewhat. Not too much. It would slide down a little bit, and then I'm going to slide it to the left. Okay, now this is all really kind of guesswork here. I'm going to have to tweak all of this. And now we will work on John's layer. So going to the first keyframe, and let's position John for the start. I think I'm just going to slide him to the left a little closer. Well, I think I'm going to have him start with his nose against the sky so that we can see him sliding against the trees. And we'll see if that's going to work. So making position and scale keyframes. And then let's jump to the last keyframe. And now working on John. Let's increase his scale, not quite as much as the rock, maybe up to 116 maybe. I don't want to lose the top of his head. And then slide him to the left so he slides in front of that tree. And well, let's take a look, see if this looks any good at all. Okay, the rock needs to move more. It's not sliding enough to the left. Let's see where it is in relationship to his body. So it starts right here under his hip. So it needs to slide to the left more. So let's go to the second keyframe for the rock, and let's slide that rock there. Will that look good? Let's see. Pretty good. And then we will do ease in and ease out for all of these keyframes. Okay, so there we go. Without too much difficulty, we have transformed a flat 2D photograph into a simulated 3D space through which we can move our camera a little bit. And sometimes people call this 2.5D animation because it's sort of halfway between 2D and 3D. But it's a really fun and interesting way to bring more to still photographs in documentary and to create a kind of immersive experience for the viewer. I hope you will experiment with this and have some fun doing parallax animation.